Hi, and welcome back to lesson 2. The previous lesson we looked at the composition of the Bible, how the various parts of it come together to make the whole, and how we can rely on it. And it raised one question you may recall from last time, and maybe something you've thought about a lot over the years, and that's why we have so many different translations. If you are a multilingual person, you perhaps read the Bible in your own language plus others. We have French-speaking friends, for example, who would read obviously in French and perhaps English, French and German, or German and English. Within each language, though, there are also a multiplicity of translations, and English is no poor relation in this regard. We have so many different Bible translations. Some of us grew up on what we call the Authorized Version or the King James Version, so written in the 1600s. And the language, of course, there is very old-fashioned and perhaps hard to understand. It's the language that a lot of people think of when they think of the Bible. And it also kind of adds to this notion that perhaps the Bible is out of date and irrelevant. So many people discount the scriptures because it's not written in a language they can understand. What they don't realize, of course, is that there are so many Bible translations today, many of which are very, very helpful. The problem with having so many is, where do you start? And if you've never looked into the Bible before, if you're a new Christian and you go into a Christian bookshop or look online and you see all these different translations, you think, well, where do I start? Assuming I can't read Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, and I want to read something in English, where do I start? Well, in the handout today, we're looking at the different translations, and on the top layer on this little chart here, I've got some boxes that need a bit of explaining: formal equivalence, dynamic equivalence, loose translation, and paraphrase. And the basic setup of what's on this sheet is borrowed from the Bible Society, although they put things slightly differently than I've done, and they haven't got it in this sort of format. But formal equivalence is when we take two languages, the language you're translating from, and we say, well, this word means such and such in the original language. I want to see what it means in my language. There's a formal equivalence between the two. Formal in the sense of an understandable and a pretty regular connection between the target language and the source language. So it's a formal equivalence. If it says it here in the original, it will say it here in the translation. And pretty much through the Bible, you'll find that there is word for word correlation. So that's a formal equivalence. Then there's dynamic equivalence, where it's not so much a sense of word by word, but what is the sense of this phrase? What is the sense even of this sentence or paragraph, perhaps? What was the original author trying to communicate in this larger piece of text? How can we sort of dynamically get the modern day equivalent in our target language? Then we have loose translation from Hebrew and Greek, and sometimes the loose translation is very loose indeed. And then there's paraphrase of the English text. So the Living Bible, for example, is a paraphrase of the American Standard Version. So that's not a paraphrase of the Greek and Hebrew text, but a paraphrase of an English translation. And a paraphrase is often a much looser translation, or a much looser means of communication, where we're kind of getting the gist of what it says in the original. Here's the gist of what it says to us today. So the Living Bible, if you're familiar with that, is very much in that sort of stream of paraphrasing what an English text says. So just go under these headings for a little minute. Formal equivalence, English Standard Version, Authorized, New American Standard, New King James, New Revised Standard, Revised Standard. They're all fairly formally equivalent between the source language and the target language, between Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, and English. And you'll see under each of those four headings in that sort of a cream color, there are Bibles in square boxes. And in between columns, so NIV and New Jerusalem Standard New Jerusalem Bible are kind of somewhere between formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. And where you put these translations on this sort of scale is a little bit of a subjective exercise. So you may, if you know a lot about this, you may think, well, that's fine, but I would actually put this box slightly further to the left or further to the right, or in a different column altogether. there is a subjectivity here. And please note that what I'm doing here is not critiquing or criticizing or being negative about any particular translation or adaptation. I'm simply saying that these are generally where it fits within the whole big scheme of things. So if you're looking for a very word-for-word translation, English Standard Version, perhaps New RSV or New King James, slightly more modern translation, of course, than the Authorized Version or King James Version 1611. Modern day English, not always ever so easy to read, but quite good for Bible, looking at different things and saying, well, actually, I could do a word study with this because I can look at the word how it's translated here and here and here, and it'll be pretty much the same. The dynamic equivalence Bibles like Jerusalem Bible, New International Reader's Version, and Revised English Bible, they are looking at concepts within not just a word, but a phrase, a sentence, or even a number of sentences. What is that roughly equivalent to? What is the general gist of meaning that we're trying to get across? And as I said, the NIV, New International Version, New Jerusalem Bible, a little bit in between. New International Version, perhaps a little bit more formally equivalent than the New International Reader's Version. And as we go across a little bit further after dynamic equivalence, we get the Contemporary English Version, the Good News Bible, today's English version, the Message Bible, and the New Living Translation. Having spent years working from the NIV, the New International Version, I've more recently picked up the New Living Translation, which I quite enjoy. And there's a freer translation in this than there is in the NIV. And I find it very thought-provoking. When I read verses that are very familiar to me in a different translation, they come alive somehow. The Message is still a translation, it's dynamic equivalence really, but heading further across to the right. If I could have columns within columns, this would be slightly further to the right because it is so generous in its use of words. You find it explains things in much greater length. So therefore, things that seem fairly straightforward in another translation have a lot more words to explain them, because Eugene Peterson was trying to get across there's actually so much more meaning behind the text than you would get in a normal English translation. I would say that's really heading towards a paraphrase, the Message Bible, but one that I've found to be hugely helpful. The last one in that section to the left of the vertical line is the Passion Translation, which Brian Simmons is bringing out now. It's not yet complete as far as I know. I think the whole New Testament is complete and certain Old Testament books. And this is really, in my view anyway, a very loose translation. And he adds in a lot that perhaps is not there probably to explain. The danger of something like the Message or the Passion Translation is that they are both the product of one person's effort. Now, Eugene Peterson, who translated the Message, he was a pastor, but he was also an Old Testament scholar, very learned man, and he was trying to bring for his church congregation, he was trying to bring up to date and make relevant the Word of God. And he wrote it in a word language that people could understand. The danger of one person being involved is there's no critique with others. And I think in Bible translation, it's really important to have a group of people who come together and say, we're going to translate this and we're going to ask each other questions and we're going to look for consistencies and inconsistencies and we're going to challenge one another. And when you do that, the whole process, I think, is much more rigorous. So the disadvantage of the Message or the Passion Translation, in my view, would simply be that they're the product of one person, enthusiastic though they may be, and they lack that scholarly interaction with other translators who would help them make the translation better or more faithful to the original. So what would you recommend? Well, I would recommend that if you're going to do a word-for-word translation, you find something that you can understand. Perhaps the New International Version is a great place to start. You look at how it may read in another translation as well, perhaps the English Standard Version, or on the other extreme, perhaps the Message or the New Living. And then as you look at it in different translations, you'll find that the translators use different words. And if nothing else, it will make you realize that translation is not an easy task. It is subjective, but it will give you perhaps a wider sense of the meaning for certain words and phrases that can be really, really helpful. So that would be my recommendation. have as a base something perhaps like the NIV, but use a more formally equivalent translation, perhaps the American Standard or English Standard Version, and a more slightly paraphrastic translation like the Message or New Living Translation, and look at the three together and think, well, this is what I believe the Word of God says. And to illustrate that, you'll have, as part of your downloadable handouts, 5 different translations of John chapter 1, verse 1. And the ESV, very much on the formal equivalent side of the scale. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The NIV is still between formal and dynamic equivalent. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which looks remarkably similar, doesn't it? In fact, they're exactly the same. The NIRV, the New International Reader's Version, coming across more into the dynamic equivalence now. In the beginning, the Word was already there. You notice a change there. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So similarities and differences. New Living Translation, slightly further across. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, the Word was God. So very similar to the first part of the NIRV. And then the Message, which is further across still, the Word was first, the Word present to God, God present to the Word. And this is just an example of how we can translate the same original text into different versions of English. But you get this sense as you look at John chapter 1, verse 1, and it's not an easy verse to understand in many respects, but it was key for each of the translators to use the word or the 4 letters W-O-R-D that spell the letter word, which is an English translation of the Greek word logos. And in each of them, they haven't explained what it was, but they just present it faithfully and leave the explanation to the reader, which I think is always a good thing to do. Is there a good translation and a bad translation? Well, this is a very subjective thing that I don't really want to get into. Is there a preference? I've explained my preference, what I would recommend. If you're starting out, if English is not your first language and you're able to get scriptures in your own language, that would be the best thing. Looking at an English translation with relatively simple English, and New Living Translation would be a good place to start. If you want to learn Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, I would encourage you to do that. But that is no small task. And the truth is that we don't need to do that in order to follow God. What I would encourage you, perhaps most of all, with all these translations, don't get bent out of shape with people who disagree with you. I've heard so much over the years and so much online right now about which translations are best and certain ones are good and some aren't. The truth is that there's so much you can learn from every translation. So I would encourage you simply to get one and get stuck into it. Ask God, God, will you just teach me from your word? Will you make clear to me what could be confusing? Will you explain it to me? Because I want my life to be different. So whichever translation it is, you'll find one that suits you. So I hope that answers some of your questions about Bible translations, and I will see you in the next lesson.